Well, good morning, everybody. How are you guys doing today? Pretty good, actually. I like it. I'll take it. So that's perfect. Hey, I'm going to go ahead and start off with a prayer because we've got some good stuff to deal with this morning. So if you would pray with me, I would love that right now. Jesus, man, I want your best. I want your best for our lives. I want your best for our church. And so I pray today, it's just another kind of piece in the puzzle of our lives as far as you developing us and growing us and shaping us more into your likeness, to embrace your life in our life in such a way that it truly shapes our life. And so I pray you would visit us today. I pray, Holy Spirit, that you would work on us today. And I pray that you would inspire us today to seek you in ways that are deeper, more profound, more desperate, because again, we know there's fullness in you. And so we look to you to do that, and we love you and thank you for what you do in us. So we just come before you now as your church to enjoy your grace and your word in our lives. In your good name, amen. So one of the things that is true for us as a church, and you're going to probably hear me refer to this a lot throughout this whole sub-series, is that it is important for us to see ourselves as followers in training, right? So the Christian life is not simply saying, I believe in a dogma or a creed or a code. It is the pursuit of Jesus. It's looking at the life of Jesus in all of his perfection and saying, my life is about following his life. And so as a church, we talk about being followers in training, that people who are following after Jesus do it in such a way where we're not just born overnight in such a way that we're just like him and we're the perfect Christian, but rather we are built over the course of time, right? And in theology, it's a big fancy word that we use called sanctification. The simple idea of that is saying every day I want to grow a little bit more like Jesus. I want to follow a little bit more thoughtfully than maybe the day before. And so as a church, we have this whole thing, built not born, followers in training. We have these different principles that we learn and know and use to know that we're actually following. And the very first principle we have is that a follower in training, they know God personally. They know him personally. This is the very first principle for all of us as Christians here at Redemption Church. And yet here's something that's critical for our theme today. For us to know God personally, ready? We need to know God accurately. I'm going to say that again. For us to know God personally, we need to know God accurately. Because if we're going to actually know who he is, then we need to truly know who he is. Because if we get off track from that, everything else comes apart. In fact, this was made apparent to me just about a week and a half ago. Something happened at the gym, and I came home and told my wife about it that I think really highlighted it for me. And so I was there working out, and you get to know some of the same people at the gym after a while, and you start conversations. And I was talking to this one guy, and he kind of started bagging on his wife, right? And typically, when that happens in my world, I go the opposite direction. I pull a judo move, and I start bragging about my wife if somebody's bagging on their wife, right? That's sort of my move, right? So I came home and told my wife this guy was doing it, so I was bragging about her. And she's like, well, what did you tell him? Which is fair. So I said, you are brilliant and you are thoughtful and you are driven and you are inspirational and everything else. And she goes, well, that's cool. Did he ask about how I looked? I'm like, that's an interesting question. Kind of he did, actually. And so she goes, well, what did you tell him? And I said, well, I told him that you're about 5'2" and you have dark skin and you have blonde curly hair and brown eyes. To which my wife was angry and left the room. Why was my wife angry and leaves the room? Because my wife is like 5'6". She has brown hair. She has white milky skin and blue eyes. None of the description physically was accurate. No wonder she would be offended. Now that didn't really happen, obviously, because I'm not that dumb. But it highlights the reality that if I describe my wife in ways that are inaccurate, that does not cause her to go, you get me. It's, you don't get me. Even if I got some of it right, where it's true, my wife is intelligent, she is driven, she is thoughtful, she is motivational. Some of those descriptors were totally true, but some were false. And to not capture her accurately does not bind us and bond us in relationship. Accuracy matters. And that's why I'm saying today, what we are looking at is a topic that we want to own and understand that getting God right, it counts. It counts. So if you have our church app, we have notes on that app. You can follow along with those notes. If you prefer just to open your Bible and look at the passage we're looking at today, we're looking at the second piece of literature in the Bible. It is a book called Exodus. The Bible is made up of 66 pieces of literature written by different people over different times and different cultures. That's what makes the Bible a unique religious document. There's really no other document like it written over such a long period of time by so many people. So there's all of this kind of coordinating to show us who God is. But in the second piece of literature, Exodus chapter 20, which is where we're looking at today, God begins to give a group of refugees, his people, the Jews, their first Bible, right? It's that one like you get when you're like 5 years old, that's kind of what they're receiving. And we're looking at the 10 commandments in the book of Exodus right now. And these are the very first commands these people have ever received from God as sort of a code to live by. And they're ingesting this, they're catching this for the first time, and God is giving them his wisdom, his insight, and his direction for their lives. Now, last week we looked at the very first commandment. And the first commandment starts in verse 3, and it says, "You shall have no other gods before me," right? And we looked at that. We investigated that because, again, this group of refugees, between spaces in their lives, they had believed in many different gods. And now God rolls in and says, all these gods that you've believed in, sun, moon, stars, river, cattle, not real. I want you to just follow me, just believe in me, just be loyal to me. And yet what's great about God intervening at this point is that they didn't have, quote, relationships with the other gods. They were just these entities that they were supposed to be slaves to. But this God is altogether different. He's relational, he's involved, he's invested, he's loving, he's kind, he's compassionate, he's merciful, he's forgiving. All these portraits that they are coming to grips with for the first time. And so God kind of enters in this way of relationship or covenant or contract and says, I want us to be connected. And so you worship only me. That is the first commandment. But then the second commandment is a little different. See, the first commandment was about not having false gods. The second commandment is about not worshiping the true God in false ways. There's a difference. The first is about not having false gods. The second is about not worshiping the true God in false ways. It starts in verse 4 of Exodus 20. He says, "You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above or that is on the earth beneath or that is in the water under the earth." If you're taking notes with us this morning, this is the first point in your notes. Commandment number 2, what God is saying here is don't cramp my style. He's saying, don't cramp my style. Don't get in the way of that. Now, I know some of you right now are looking at this saying, all right, don't make any graven images. Great, this is a week off for me because I don't make graven images. I'm not going to go home and melt down all of the precious metals in my home and craft some kind of round-bellied bald guy that I rub his belly and make prayers to. I'm not going to do that. Right? I'm not going to go home and carve soap to the hygiene god. You're going to think, this isn't for me. And yet, when I look at this commandment and I think about it in my own life, I realize that actually this thing hits more close to home than we realize. Because this isn't so much about idols representing other gods. Like I said earlier, it's about how we can improperly worship the true God. So in other words, I'm going to use a phrase. This is about idolizing God. Idolizing God. And I know that even sounds a little bit weird, so I'm going to try to get this underway and help us understand that what God is getting out here is minimizing the majesty of the Maker. He doesn't want us to minimize who he truly is. In fact, this word graven image is a single word in Hebrew. It's pesel. And it's the idea of taking God into our own hands and redrafting him, rewriting him, retailoring him to fit what our priorities may be. Or maybe it's reducing him to make him more palatable to what we like. Or maybe it's taking parts of God and then rearranging those so we go, now that's the God I can follow. See, that's the risk that we all have in light of this. And so what God is getting at is, you know what? Don't simplify me. Don't box me in. Don't reduce me down. Don't solve me. Don't shrink me. Don't rewrite me. Whether it be with images or with ideas, because that's going to be the temptation. We may not do it with physical, iconic things, but we may do it with ideas in all sorts of ways. In fact, to kind of drill this down a little bit, I want to look at number 2 in your notes, the danger of drawing edges on the edgeless God. The danger of drawing edges on the edgeless God. Like I was saying, we have this tendency to sort of elevate some things about God and kind of de-emphasize other things about God, or we get images in our mind or ideas in our psyche about who God is, and then they begin to sort of drive an agenda for us. And so I'm going to test this for just a second, just for fun, how we tend to draw edges, even when we don't mean to, right? I want you to right now, in your head, picture God. Picture God in your head. Now, as you're thinking about whatever God might look like, is he old or is he young? Does he have a beard or is he clean shaven? Is it gray or does he look like Carrot Top, big curly redhead guy? Right? Is he in a robe or is he in khakis? If he's in a robe, is it a bathrobe or a Roman toga robe? Is he carrying a scepter or does he have a putter? When you think about his voice, is it Morgan Freeman or is it Pee Wee Herman? Right? Like what's your image? Because here's the thing, almost all of that is wrong on whatever side. Right? We read the Bible, we see Jesus as God is spirit. He does not have a body like us. But instantly we find ourselves going, well, I'm trying to understand an incomprehensible God. And so I begin to draw edges on that God. He looks like this, he doesn't look like that. He functions this way, he doesn't function that way. And we have this reductionist challenge. We all do. Now I know some of you are like, I just pictured a big burning ball of light. But it was sitting on a throne, right? And so we still want to capture images. And it's not to say that there aren't images that are associated with God, such as a throne. But there's so much more to the picture that sometimes the risk is we lose the more and we try to reduce. And people do it in different ways. If we practicalize it for just a minute, there are some people that look at God and they reduce him down to the big guy upstairs God, right? Right, and this is kind of just like a nod to a kind of an agnostic vision of God. I don't really know quite much about him. I just think he's the big guy upstairs, like he's the dude on the 3rd floor of your apartment building, right? And that's how we reduce him down. Or some people go, well, you know, I don't really give God a ton of attention, but when life is hard, then he's the bail me out God. I promise I'll never do this again. If you just get me out of this once, that would be awesome, God, thank you. Other people have the lazy boy God, right? I just like to curl up in God's lap. Be the lazy boy God. Some have the lotto God or the Santa Claus God. Here's what I need today, God. And it's just constantly, here's the list of things. Maybe that's the reduction that we engage in. Others have the Vulcan God. He's emotionless, right? He's just like very logical and intellectual, right? That's maybe the reduction view. Others have the Terminator God. He's just angry all the time, ready to judge humanity. Some have the tolerant God. He's just love. Others have the intolerant God. He's just judgment. Some have the theological God, which is he's just a list of attributes on a piece of paper. Others have the Hillsong God. He's just all emotion, right? See, I think we all have a tendency to kind of see God from these different points of view. And many of those things I just listed aren't necessarily untrue of God. Right? When I give the list, I'm not trying to say that those are devoid of a sense of truthfulness. Some of them are maybe a little more flippant than others. But the thing is going to be that God can be many different elements of description and also so much more. And when we kind of land on one particular angle and make that our big deal, what we tend to do is shrink him down to the image we prefer. We take him into our own hands and we draw edges and we craft an image. And what this command here is saying is you need to make sure you always keep your vision expanded and growing and learning as to who God is, because God is limitless. That doesn't mean he doesn't have distinct character. The Bible reveals that. It doesn't mean that he doesn't have distinct will. The Bible reveals that. But as soon as we try to put him in a box, we begin to fail in this commandment. And so this is where we have to have a sensitivity and go, all right, so my life goal then, in light of this command, is to always be looking more into who God is and growing more in my knowledge of who he reveals himself to be. Not based on my priority or my agenda or even my comfort level, but really just based on who he shows himself to be. And I find that one of the greatest ways we as Christians can grow in this is to look very particularly at the person of Jesus. And here's why. In your notes, it's number 3. It's really in Jesus. It is the only one imaged only once. So this is the only time that God decided to say, I'm gonna give you an image to understand me in the context of. In fact, Colossians 1:15 says that he, Jesus, is the image of the invisible God. He's the image of the invisible God. In Hebrews 1:3 it says this, he is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. The only time that we could look in the Bible and say God sort of, quote, took up edges is in the person of Jesus, because Jesus is God. And when he did that for you, and he did that for me, and he did that for the church, and he did that for the world, and he did it as a servant so that we could know God more profoundly, more powerfully, and more personally. And so when we're trying to understand, man, how do I understand God? How do I honor the second commandment? It's where we say, I'm going to look at the person of Jesus. I'm going to learn from the person of Jesus. This is why, again, I say we are followers in training, and followers in training know God personally, in particular by examining and seeking to imitate the life we see in the person of Christ. Now, part of that is Jesus says, hey, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So then we look at the whole Old Testament, we see the character of God, and we begin to absorb all of that. But that's a lifelong journey of investment, continued growth, and continued investigation. We can never exhaust the full range of who he is. And so this is why we want to grow, and this is why we want to learn about this. This is why we want to worship the one true God in right ways. And we worship him not because God's like, I'm so insecure, I need your worship. See, God calls us to worship. God calls us to the second commandment because he built us to respond to who he is. He designed us for worship, and we see it all the time, right? We have a tendency as human beings to want to express worship. Now, oftentimes it's toward all kinds of crazy, unhealthy things. We worship our sports teams, and we worship celebrities, and we worship political points of view, and we get excited about all kinds of things, but that's because we were designed first and foremost to be explosively expressive about our God. So when God calls us to worship, it's because he's calling us back to what we're built for. And so this is why he's saying, man, know who I am. And the more you know who I am, man, the more you're going to want to worship in the way that you were designed to do it. This is why we continue in this life quest and journey to understand who he is in more and more accurate ways. Now, if I take this command and even drill it down a little bit more, what we want to understand about this is that what God is giving in this particular code is the passionate protection that he offers to us. That's what this is about, the passionate protection of God. This is why the commandment goes on in verse 5. He says, not only do you not want to make any kind of graven image of me, don't idolize me, but moreover, you shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, I'm a jealous God. Now, some people look at these commands and they're turned off because they seem like they're all put in the negative. But I look and I go, a good parent says don't. right? If you're the parent that just says, hey, little Timmy, go outside and play. And you don't say, but don't play in the street. You're not being a good parent. You want to say, go do this, but here's the borders of what you don't want to do as well. So when God gives us command, I know it seems like, well, it's all negative. Don't do this. Well, but God is doing it because he has a passionate protection for us. He's like, I know your nature. I know you're going to do the opposite of this. We talked about it last week. So he says, don't do this, and it's going to go well. Why? Because I'm passionately seeking to protect you. So in this sense, he says, here's what you don't want to do. You don't want to bow down to them. You don't want to serve lesser visions of who I am. You don't want to serve lesser visions of who I am, and here's why. It weakens us. It weakens us. This is why he goes on to say, and I'm jealous about this reality. Now again, I think as humans, and probably as Americans, we sometimes look at the word jealousy, and we almost see it as almost always negative. Right, we go, well, that's a possessive word, it's a selfish word, it's a word that shows you're easily hurt, or man, it's erupting with emotion or whatever else. And yet I want to clear up a couple of things about jealousy. First of all, when it pertains to God, God is not at the mercy of his feelings. Right, so part of the problem with our understanding of jealousy is that we see it as something that is spontaneous based on a catalyst that it's so spontaneous for us we don't have a lot of control over it. God is never out of control when it comes to his emotions. And so jealousy in our understanding isn't quite the same as jealousy for God. Right? For us, it can sometimes be reactive and it can be scornful and everything else. But for God, it's measured and controlled. But the other thing about this, and why I think jealousy is actually a good thing, is it's built in the covenantal relationship that we have to God, or the contract, right? So remember I talked about how the 10 Commandments were on stones about the size of my Bible? 10 of them were on one stone, 10 were on the other. It's duplicates, one's for God, one's for us. And it's a contract of union. And when you enter into a contract of union that says, I'm going to love you and you're going to love me and this is what we're agreeing on together, then suddenly jealousy is very valuable. Because it says, I have a passionate, fervent care for you. I'm so invested into you. I think about you often and I'm worried for you if you go off track. Right? So if I likened it to my marriage to my wife, Ellen, who is, again, 5'6" and brunette and blue eyes, not that other version. I go, in our relationship, I've pledged this set of promises. I'm going to love you for better, worse, rich or poor, sickness or in health. And therefore, my jealousy is my fervent, passionate care for the one I've pledged myself to. I'm jealous for her in a good way, not in a selfish, controlling way, but in a way that says, you know what, I care about the one that I cherish. And so in the same way, God is giving this because he goes, I know if you get off track with either number one or number two, it's not going to go well for you. It's going to have other challenges associated with it. In fact, I would say that in the passionate protection of God, here's what he knows. He knows that if we give in to misrepresentations of him, the first thing, if you're taking notes, all misrepresentations of God, they dilute us. They dilute us because, again, a misrepresentation of God is an illusion. It's a fantasy, right? It doesn't have true substance attached to it. It's the difference between junk food and a healthy feast. And so God's like, man, when you rewrite me and you reduce me and you peel layers off of me, it's not really me at that point. And so it dilutes you. More than that, misrepresentations of God, they drain us. They drain us. Because what we see throughout the Bible is that life is associated with God, right? So the closer we get to who God truly is, the more we find life in that and life from that. That's why people that you see faithfully walk with God for like decades of their life, they're the people that seem like, man, they are just so close to God. And their life seems so rich and robust, even if the conditions are rough. Because there is this life that is derived from God. And yet when we miss who he truly is, then it drains us more than fills us. And then I'd say also see in your notes, all misrepresentations of God, they deceive us. They deceive us. When we start saying, well, my God would never X, and my God is always Y, and we begin to try to rescue God from himself, we read the Bible, and there's certain things we're like, I don't know if I like that about God in the Bible, and I know other people wouldn't like that about God, and so I'm going to drop that part of God so that he's a little bit more marketable to the people in my life, and even more marketable to me, because that's uncomfortable, but that is comfortable, and we begin to rearrange and cut him into pieces and format a God for our own liking. It ultimately deceives us because what we think we're doing is recrafting him so that we can have better relationship. And yet God is looking at that saying, that's not who I am. Therefore, you're not really having a relationship with me. Right? You're just redesigning me for what you want, not for who I am. And so you think you're getting closer, but you're really getting further away in the process. And so this is why I'm saying it deceives us. I go back to what our mission is as Christians. Right? It's to become more like Jesus, followers in training, to become more like God, more like Christ. But if we're getting him wrong, then we can't become more like him. Right? We just become more like other handcrafted idols that we create in his name. So this is why God is spending so much time on the second commandment. You'll notice if you look at the commandments, this is among the longest. It's kind of, there's a reason. Because of this, God continues, and he gives a poignant promise in light of this commandment. Going back, he says, you shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. Here's what happens. Visiting the iniquities of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. But showing steadfast love to thousands, to those who love me, and they keep my commandments. Now, people read this part and they go, wow, that seems pretty harsh. Visiting the iniquity of the children to the third and fourth generation. Some versions say punishing the iniquities. And so they picture God at this point like one of the Sopranos, you know? I'm going to get you, your kids, your grandkids, your great-grandkids, right? You're all gonna die, you know, and like we see it like this really kind of like, wow, that's thuggish of God right there, right? But let's see if I can break this down and give you a little bit of a sense of perspective. Visiting. It's a word used often by God. In Hebrew, it can go either way as punish or help or aid, right? So context drives whether it's negative or positive. Now here, we see it's visiting iniquity. So that gives us the negative connotation in the text. And iniquity is this idea of to twist or to bend or to curve. And so here's what I think God is getting at. If you idolize me, and what he means by that is if you start to rewrite me, redefine me, cut away at me, add to me or subtract from me, that will be a long, hard road. But here's the thing, on the long, hard road, here's God's guarantee. I'm still there with you. On the long, hard road, I visit you. I show up. So the tension's going to be, we're constantly bending God to our wishes, and then God's going to be constantly grabbing us and trying to get us back on a straight line. So he's like, you can try to twist me as much as you want, but it's going to get really fatiguing really fast, and it's going to wear you out, it's going to wear your kids out, and your grandkids out, and your great-grandkids out, if you try to manipulate who I am, because I'm going to keep showing up to try to straighten you out. And so the emphasis is he's in our mess, and he's in our mess to fix the problem. Now I'm going to try to practicalize this, because I think there's two ways personally, that we tend to want to, rearrange God for our ends and how it can have an impact on our families. There's two trajectories that come out of why we try to alter who God is. One trajectory is we change him to make him more legalistic. And the other is we change him to make him more loose. Right? So you could boil it down to two. right? So some people will look at God, and I know this seems strange because we're usually worried about the looseness. Oh, we're going to change God to make him all fuzzy, feel good, no conviction, no judgment, no hell, no nothing. Like we're just going to make him just mushy. And so we're worried about the mushy. And so you know what we sometimes do? We become the legalist. We're so concerned that he's going to be soft, we make him hard. And that is an equal damnable danger. Right? When Jesus rolled into the world, who was he up against? People that had legalized God. People who had made him an idol of their religiosity. And Jesus is like, you guys are a mess. You create burdens too heavy to bear. You've lost all sense of grace. You're filled with pride. This is not me. You are sons of the devil, thinking you are advocates for God. Right? So he was hard on legalism. At the same time, there is a danger, and Jesus is hard on the looseness in the book of Revelation. He's like, you guys have gotten all loose. You've lost the vision of who God really is there. You have no sense of ethic or standard or boundary. And both are dangerous to families, to the third and fourth generation. How many of you have met people that grew up in legalistic homes, and they're turned off to faith? And how many of you met people that were in really loose homes, and therefore it was like, why does it even matter? Following God. Who cares? There's no teeth to it. That's why I'm saying both of these extremes are things that we sometimes do, the sin of indulgence or the sin of arrogance. And so God says, you know what, if you do that, it's going to hurt. It's going to hurt your family. If you give me a facelift, it's going to have generational effect. He says, and if you go even deeper, here's what it means. It means that you hate me. You hate me. Now, I read that and I'm like, you know what? There's been times in my life over being a Christian for a long time now, quarter of a century, where I think I have certainly dipped into wanting to rescue God from himself in the Bible. Soften the edges, take this out of the equation a little bit, just kind of this redesign, draw the borders. And I would never think I was hating him. But see, God sees from his perspective. He's like, no, you hate me when you do that. Let me give you an example of this. Let's say you decide to start dating a person. This goes back before you're married. You're going to date a person. And going into dating them, you already see their flaws, and so you're going to change them in dating them. Now, is that loving the person in any way? Or is that saying, you know what, you're mostly okay, but I need to do some fine-tuning here. I need to really redesign you, right? Or you say, I'm going to marry a person. They got some flaws, but I can change that after we get married. Good luck, A. But B, you're not taking the person at face value for who they are, right? Now you've got a God that's perfect, which means you cannot make God better than God. Right? I mean, he's at the top, man. There's nothing left to adjust. And so God's like, if you step in and decide, I like this, don't like that, I'm going to change this, I'm going to drop this, add this, everything else, then you hate me. You don't like me for me. And so he just calls it out hard, calls it out fast, cut me down to size, and it's not love. He says, because, when you do that and you remove parts of me from me, you're not going to experience love, life, power, or my presence. I promise you. I promise it hurts. Equally, though, he says, I promise, if you just let me be me, you take me at the full face value of who I share myself to be, I show steadfast love to thousands. And notice the juxtaposition to this. Some people look at this and go, wow, he's so mean. 3-4 generations will be hurt. But on the flip, he says thousands will be blessed. Right? So the blessing is way bigger than the burden. To accept who God is transforms thousands of lives. To change who he is has maybe a smaller impact. It still hurts, but it has a smaller impact. But boy, to embrace who he is, huge, huge impact. And he says, man, I bless thousands, he says, for those who love me. And again, the juxtaposition, hate me versus love me. Says, you rewrite me, you hate me. If you reply to me, you love me. And that's why he wraps it up by saying, by keeping my commandments. If you love me, you keep my commandments. See, what we see here is the faithful formula of command number 2, right? The faithful formula. What's the formula? Well, there's bad formulas and there's a good formula. The bad formula is love minus obedience is spiritualism. Love minus obedience is spiritualism. It just says, you know what, I like this notion of God, but there's nothing of my life that's behind my statement of love. So I don't actually do what he tells me to do, but I give a nod to who he is. I grab my fishing pole, I go out on Sunday, and I enjoy God and nature as I'm fishing. I do what I want to do, but I acknowledge there's probably something, and so I love the something, and it's just spiritualism, right? And that's about as far as it goes. On the flip, you have people that are all about the obedience, but it's minus the love, and that's legalism. That's legalism. And again, Jesus was just as concerned about this as he was the former. To the former, we actually see in 1 John 2, it says, if you love me, but you don't obey my commands, you're a liar and the truth isn't in you. But here Jesus says, you know what, these guys, they obey the law, but their hearts are far from God. It's in vain that they go through the rituals and process. Because again, obedience without love, it's just legalism. It's not what God is seeking. The right formula is love plus obedience. That's covenantalism. Love plus obedience is covenantalism. It's the relationship, it's the union, it's the contract that says, this is how I show it. In fact, if we talked about Dr. Chapman's 5 love languages, God has a love language. Love plus obedience. That's how God understands love language. And I get it. Right? In my relationship to Ellen, like I said, I made these promises when we were married, better or worse, rich or poor, sickness or in health. And if I just tell her all the time I love her, but I don't actually do the things that require love, if I don't hold to the promises I made to cherish for better or for worse, for richer, for poor, if I don't do that stuff, she's not going to go, you know what, just your words of love are enough for me. Don't worry about the actions. Right? No, the actions communicate the affection, and at the same time, there has to be affection to really ground the actions. And so God says, man, that is the formula. You love me and you obey me for who I am, not who you want me to be, not who you recraft me to be, but who I state myself to be to you. And so I think the walk away for us today is the last thing in your notes. It means we need to always expand the mental edges of our edgeless God. We need to always expand the edges, the mental edges of our edgeless God. Right? Because again, I think we just have a tendency to kind of put him in a box. Whether we mean to or not, it's just sort of natural human nature. And so I think the reason God continues to grow us is so that our vision of him expands. And this is what he's seeking of us. In fact, in Isaiah 55, it starts in verse 6. It says, seek the Lord while he may be found and call upon him when he's near. Let the wicked forsake his way and the unrighteous man his thoughts. Let him return to the Lord that he may have compassion on him and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon. What I love about the first part of that is God saying, I'm accessible. So seek me. I can be experienced. I can be found. I can be dwelt with. So man, I'm accessible. So seek me out. And I think that's a part of what we want to remember as followers in training. Again, the first step is what? They know God personally, which means we need to seek. We need to press into the accessible God, but at the same time, the same accessible God is mysterious. This is why he says in verse 8, for my thoughts are not your thoughts. Neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. See, there's equally this truth that we're never in this life going to be able to exhaustively know God. Right? We're going to be limited, but we're in pursuit. Which is why not only do fit people know God personally, but another one of our principles is that fit people, followers in training, they seek God daily. And so that's what I'm saying. Every day is an opportunity to expand the mental borders, the mental edges of our edgeless God, to grow a little bit more in understanding them today than we did yesterday. And in that keeping in mind that we want to do this by turning away from the lesser gods, but also turning away from visions of a lesser God, right? And embracing God for who he is, cultivating snapshots of his wonder and his beauty and his grace and his truth and his awesomeness and his intervention, and saying, God, show me more of yourself in creation. Show me more of yourself in your word, so that in seeing you more clearly, I can experience you in a more powerful, powerful way. Let's go ahead and pray together. Jesus, I pray that we would take this particular command in a serious way, like in a truly serious way. And I guess I say that because I know how easy it is to let our faith be sort of our family values. And I know how easy it is for our faith to be our disciplines and duties. And I know how easy it is to kind of hopscotch from emotional thing to emotional thing, even that enriches our faith, whether it be music or Sundays or whatever. But I pray that none of those things would be a substitute for really knowing you, for looking deeply into you and being desperate for more of you. And Father, for us to cry out as kids that say, show me your glory, just like we're going to see later in Exodus with Moses, where he just wanted more of you. I pray that that's what we would want, more of you. I pray that we don't try to carve away at you. I pray that we don't try to replace pieces of you. I pray that we don't look and decide we're the arbiters of what your character really is. But we will let your word guide us, and from your word see you then in the wonder of all that you have made. And from that it would create deeper wonder and deeper worship in us. I pray that you show up in our lives in ways that are undeniable. And we seek these in your good name.